This special program is sponsored by Willamette University.
Welcome to this exclusive K2 Your Voice, Your Vote digital forum with the biggest change in the history of Portland City government coming in January. The old city council of 4 commissioners and 1 mayor will be long gone. In its place, 12 new Portland City councilors. Voters will pick 3 councilors from 4 new districts. Dozens have applied for the jobs. And today we'll hear from Portland City Council candidates from District 3, which includes parts of Northeast and Southeast Portland. Candidates are here to answer your questions.
How are they going to focus on the affordable housing, whether it's rentals or purchases?
What is it going to take for you to actually make things more of a livable wage?
Where candidates stand on the important challenges facing you. Your vote will have a huge impact on Portland's future. This live digital forum with candidates from District 3 starts right now.
From K2 and Willamette University, this is Your Voice, Your Vote, Portland City Council Forum with Steve Dunn.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining me on this Monday. With me today, 7 Portland City Council candidates from the newly created District 3 here to answer your questions. I'll introduce them in just a minute. But first of all, a message from the program's sponsor, Willamette University.
I'm Steve Thorsett, president of Willamette University. We are proud to support K2's Your Voice, Your Vote election coverage. For nearly 2 centuries, Willamette's mission has been to educate leaders for civic society. We believe a healthy democracy depends on thoughtful and ethical leaders in government, and especially on an informed electorate. We're grateful for the discussions and debates K2 brings to our community. Thanks for watching.
And thank you, Steve. And due to time, we could only invite a limited number of candidates to this forum, but we have a way for you to hear from nearly 100 candidates who are running for either Portland Mayor or Portland City Council. Starting this week, in fact, on KTU.com and on YouTube, you can watch candidate interviews from the city's 4 districts and read their written statements. Just look for K2's Know Your Candidates interviews. The candidate criteria for this forum includes filing to run for office with the city, filing a candidate committee with the Secretary of State's office, filing contribution and expenditure reports with the Secretary of State's office, receiving certification to participate in Portland's small donor elections, and being among the candidates with the highest number of individual contributions. Here are the District 3 candidates in alphabetical order today. We have Jesse Cornett, Daniel DeMello, Chris Flannery, Angelita Murillo, Steve Novick, Lam Osman, and Luke Zach. Also invited but unable to attend today, Tiffany Koyama Lane. She's a school teacher who is unable to attend the forum because she's working with her students. The candidates drew numbers to see who would start. And we're going to begin with Angelina today. And what the question we're going to begin with is kind of an easy one for you. We just want 1 or 2 words out of this one. Your #1 focus as a member of the Portland City Council. #1 focus, and Angelita, we begin with you.
Housing and homelessness.
Steve Novick.
Making sure that we're spending public money as effectively and efficiently as possible.
Lam.
Climate change.
Luke Zach.
Also housing and homelessness.
Jesse Cornett.
Homelessness and public safety.
Daniel DeMello.
Homelessness and accountability.
Chris Flannery.
Living wages.
Okay, there you go. We sent a news crew to District 3 to find out what questions Portlanders have for the candidates. There was a common theme among the people we talked to. They're concerned about the cost of living in Portland. We begin this forum with this question. Let's play that.
I would just ask, what is it going to take for you to actually make things more of a livable wage?
Livable wage. What do you consider a livable wage in Portland? I want to ask you folks that first of all. What will you do as a city councilor to grow more family wage jobs in Portland? We'll give you each a chance to answer. Keep your responses to a minute if you possibly can. We'll begin with you, Steve Novick. Go ahead.
So the city can't establish its own minimum wage. The state prohibits us from doing that. What the city can, with its own employees and with its contracting, commit to having livable wages and good working conditions for workers that work either for the city or on city sponsored projects. And we can also try to attract employers that provide a livable wage. That sometimes cities have grand economic development strategies that don't really work, but if you have a city where it's safe and clean and attractive and has a good transportation system, then folks will come. Simply providing a livable city is a good economic development strategy.
Lamb, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think we definitely also just need more jobs available. A lot of people are struggling to just find a job, and I think Portland has an economic crisis. And we need to make sure that those jobs, especially if you tend to work with people who are houseless, or if you are customer facing, those jobs need to have benefits, and so that you can actually retain those jobs. So yeah, we need livable wages, and then we also need people who are working, able to like survive and be able to show up to work and be healthy and whatnot. So,
Luke Sack, your thoughts on this question?
To answer your question about what a livable wage means to me, when we look at Portlanders, the two highest cost centers for average families is housing and transportation. So first things first, we need to improve our affordability of housing and our accessibility of housing. As for transportation, I think we can do a lot to invest in our systems to make them more convenient, more safe, and less costly for people to do. And I think when you lower those cost centers, it frees up their money to be spent elsewhere. And I also think we can do a lot more to be investing in small businesses and create the vibrant community that helps support all of the workers.
Going to come back around to the front here. Jesse Cornett, you're up.
So we have an affordability issue in Portland today, and we actually do need to grow the wages in any way possible in various sectors. My campaign is centered around resolving the homelessness and addiction crises in Portland. I work in that policy area by day, addiction. And if you look at what we're paying the workers in each of those areas, we're pulling folks who have lived experience into working in those areas, and we're not paying a living wage. We need to pay a thriving wage to attract folks to do that work. And what that's going to do is that's going to keep the streets cleaner than we have them today and have a net overall growth impact on wages across the city.
Daniel DeMello, you are up.
You know, half of District 3 residents make more than $75,000 a year. And nationally, I believe more than 2/3 of the inflation that we're seeing can be tied back to housing costs. So as much as I'd love to support small businesses, right, I understand we have the highest employment rate in our small businesses. 28% of Portlanders are employed in small businesses. I would like to focus on those housing costs in particular, making sure that we're bringing housing costs down, because even if you get a 10% raise this year, if your rent goes up 10%, then all we're doing by increasing wages is handing more money to property owners.
Chris Flannery, it's about the livable wage.
So the MIT Living Wage Calculator for the Portland Metropolitan Statistical Area says we're a little bit north of $27 for a living wage in Portland for a single person with no dependents. To Steve's point, the state has a preemption against the minimum wage for a city, and we can, for city employees, subcontractors, or in exchange for an incentive from the city, require a certain wage level. Also, we could lobby to change that state law. I work in inclusionary housing as a day job, and that was preempted by the state until 2016, 2017. Some things that we can do, apprenticeship programs so that kids getting out of school have a path to a living wage job to keep them in Portland. We can look at project labor agreements for all of this construction we're planning on doing over the next number of years to address the affordable housing crisis. And additionally, one of the huge cost centers is those benefits that Ahlam was talking about. And so finding a way for Portland as a city to assist those small businesses in providing benefits and retirement, I think, would be essential.
Angelina?
Yeah, as Steve and Chris stated, the City of Portland does not have power over setting a minimum wage. But I think that the main thing that I've heard when I'm talking with workers from SEIU, workers that work at the convention center in downtown, is that people do not have affordable places to live, and there are no affordable 2-bedroom apartments in the city of Portland, particularly for Black, Latino, and Indigenous families that are living on the median income. So I think that our main role in all of this is to ensure that we have housing affordability, and that includes taking a look at certain things like RealPage, AI software that is being used by landlords across the country to artificially inflate rent prices. Oregon is finally joining the lawsuit nationally, and I think that Portland needs to make sure that we're holding folks accountable and making sure that our rent prices are the right amount that they should be.
Something we hear frequently in Portland is the high cost of housing here, of course. We have a question for the candidates on that topic. Let's listen to this now.
how are they going to focus on the affordable housing, whether it's rentals or purchases? How can we create a program or a system or something in play to help with the affordability of housing?
Start with affordable housing here for either renters or buyers. As a city councilor, what would you propose or support to provide more affordable housing in the city of Portland? Lamb, let's begin with you.
With affordable housing, I think, well, first off, we need to build more affordable housing. There's a lot of housing, well, not a lot, but there's housing now that's just vacant. So I think working directly with landlords and property managers and build that relationship with them to help them decrease the price of rent. I think also there needs to be affordable housing, or there needs to be programs that prevent people from getting evicted in the first place. So investing in resources and support systems for that would be really great.
Luke Sack?
When you look outward at other cities that have attacked affordable housing and inflation and seen what has worked, we can see examples of that, like with Minneapolis, and they've really invested in housing production. And when you look locally here at Portland, we are underproducing. We need to be making about 5,000 or 6,000 units of housing a year to attack that deficit and prepare for the future needs of the city. So we need to be focused on that. We just recently had the City Council approve the housing production strategy. It's a 35-point plan, and I think there's a lot of good in that. We need to be making sure that we can attract capital investments into the entire continuum of housing affordability so that it can make it more accessible across the board. And lastly, I think that we need to have more programs here that will support access to home ownership.
Jesse Cornett, high cost of housing, your thoughts?
Sure, to continue on Luke's point, we need to be building 5,000 units per year in Oregon just to keep ahead of the curve. As of last month, we had started 500 units in the city of Portland. So we're not keeping up. And if you look at two specific ways the city can help, number one, what we do when there are building booms, we hire and then train up permitting staff. And then when there's a lag, we lay them off. And when it happens again, we go through the same madness again. And that slows down our ability to issue permits in a timely fashion for builders, and time kills all good deals. A second piece of that is we really haven't kept pace with the time when it comes to updating our zoning ordinances. One specific example, we have people building ground floor retail all over the city where there are no variances in some places. That square footage is just sunk cost all around Portland, sitting empty right now. So the city needs to be a little more open-minded to the fact that the times are a-changin'.
Daniel, your turn.
I will get into the weeds on housing policy. I think the way that the state legislature, for example, dropped the single stair reform was a mistake, and I'd like to see the city push the legislature to bring that all the way through. I think we can fiddle with the permitting, and I think that's really important. We need to get permitting out fast. I know that's why we saw the Gordon fireplace fall apart over the last few years. But what really doesn't make any sense to me is that if you want to build housing, if you want to build an ADU in your backyard, you're going to have to spend more than $30,000 on system development charges before you even get your shovel in the ground. And meanwhile, my neighbor who bought a duplex and converted it back to a single-family home didn't have to pay anything. Why does someone who is contributing to solving the problem have to pay, and someone who's causing the problem not have to pay? We don't send water bills to firefighters. We shouldn't be charging right now for building housing when we're in a housing crisis.
Chris, you are up.
So very excitingly, ADUs actually have an SDC exemption, and there's a 5-year moratorium on that ground floor retail requirement. There's been a lot of work put into the permitting process. There are a lot of revisions that are being made. We recently changed zoning to basically eliminate single-family zoning with the residential infill project. So I'm very excited to see what's happening on the city side. I think one of the biggest issues is what was mentioned earlier, getting developers to bring their money into Portland. And part of that issue is Portland workers don't make enough money to pay the rents that are needed to support these types of projects. So increasing the wages in Portland will be a huge step. I'd love to see us pursue more modular housing, which allows us to build more units throughout the whole year and not be limited by weather. It's also cheaper, safer, and more efficient. Beyond that, creating something like that within Portland would be an economic driver and another place where we could have living wage jobs, apprenticeships, and again, a way to bring that economic power to Portland for Portland.
Angelita, you are up.
Yeah, I think The building of housing is absolutely necessary, and we have seen that in other cities where they have just focused on building housing without creating protections for rent increases, that it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. We are seeing some really imaginative takes, like in Seattle, they passed a ballot initiative that would build public housing, and I think that's something that the city of Portland needs to look into. We need to look into housing that is not going to be moved based on price, based on market discussions that are happening. It needs to be stable and consistent. We also could do things like land trusts, because the city of Portland owns a lot of empty lots of land, and land is the most expensive thing. I also think that we have a lot of opportunities to address zoning. My biggest heartbreak when I worked in City Hall was hearing that the Concordia University dorms were available for purchase in order to renovate them into communal housing or anything we wanted, and the only restriction was that it was zoned as a school instead of housing. Those are the kinds of imaginative opportunities we need to seize.
Steve Novick.
So I agree with what a lot of folks have said. We need to continue to change the zoning laws to make more kinds of housing legal in more parts of the city. When I was in the council, I was the first person to talk about making it legal to build duplexes and triplexes in places where they've been illegal. We need to fix the permitting system. Another thing that we need to think about is a lot of the investment that comes to build housing is national investors, and national investors are afraid to invest in Portland now because they think that we're filled with crime and homeless camps, and that's somewhat exaggerated. But it is a fact that if we went after the reality and the perception of being a city filled with crime and homeless camps, that would attract more investment to build more housing. But also I want to say there's a national housing crisis. In the wake of the Great Recession, banks became more conservative about investing in housing. Developers became more conservative. The New York Times, and now with high interest rates, it's a problem everywhere. The New York Times had an article a couple of weeks ago about how in Kalamazoo, Michigan, there is now a housing crisis. It would be nice if the federal government actually started investing in building housing itself like it did before Ronald Reagan.
It's not just affordable housing the city is lacking, you know that. The city's housing needs analysis predicts, in fact, this right here. We need to build 120,000 new homes in the next 20 years to meet the current and projected demand. The city is far below that goal. What steps would you take to increase the availability of housing? So increasing the availability of housing is the next question here. We're going to begin with Luke Zach on this one. Luke?
Yeah, so to start with increasing availability, something that Angelita talked about was making sure that we keep them at an affordable rate. There are ways the city can do that, and that's through additional public housing. Right now there are many apartment buildings that are for sale at a far reduced rate because of the market conditions that the city could look at acquiring. There's also the concept of acquiring office and industrial space that can be converted, especially looking at downtown or the central city. That would provide a lot of opportunities for increasing the percentage of residential units there and provide more possibilities for people to live in the city there.
Jesse Cornett, availability of housing.
Sure. If you look at the #1 cause of homelessness in America, it is lack of affordable housing. So we have talked a lot as candidates in today about affordable housing, but we also need housing at all levels. And some of the measures that I talked about in the first answer are very applicable here. The permitting issues that we're facing aren't just as it pertains to affordable housing. It's all housing that I'm focused on.
Daniel?
You know, I think we need to look at public housing, but the truth is when we built public housing and we built housing that was supported by the government in the last couple of years, it came in at more than $400,000 per unit. Whereas right now there are buildings on the market today where you can buy units for as little as $200,000 a unit. I think too often when local government goes and looks at these problems, we go and do our shopping at Whole Foods, and we should be shopping at Winco, right? Right now, we need housing fast, and we need housing for everyone. And I think we're throwing too many other items in the mix that are getting in the way of us getting that housing out cheaply and efficiently. Because if we can bring down that cost of that housing we're building publicly 10%, we can house 10% more people with those funds there. On the other hand, I know that just a couple years ago, we were the 3rd most popular place in the country for investors to bring in money to build housing. Today, we're 53rd, behind Detroit. And I think looking at these perceptions around homelessness and crime, they're not just perceptions. People are seeing every day extreme poverty and depravity on our streets, and it does not make you excited about investing in a place that has not been able to handle that.
Housing availability. You are next, Chris.
The city has a lot of land around Portland, and I would love to see us take that land and put cottage clusters on there, small units, starter homes that are affordable to regular working Portlanders at starter home prices. One of the big issues I've been hearing about the newer homes that are being built, those tall townhouses, is that you've got generally a 3-bedroom home that is being maximized for profit for the developer, because they're in this, it's a business for them, right? They're gonna make their money. And so you take a lot, you divide it, you put 4 houses on there, but they're all $300,000, $400,000. What if the city took the same amount of land, put more modest houses on there, some sort of ground trust to prevent the property tax and the land value from being a barrier, and we're able to offer, again, starter home accessible ways to get working Portland families out of apartments.
Angelito.
Yeah, I think some of the encampments that we have right now that are being run by the city, the mass encampments, cost millions of dollars every single year. There is a huge budget put aside for that, and I think it would be much better to invest that in purchasing empty hotels or other buildings that give people a closed door or a place where they can go privately. As Luke talked about, converting empty buildings in downtown is also something I'm interested in. It's very difficult due to the way that the piping system is set up. It's not usually built for a lot of people to live in one place, but I think we can see some single occupancy dwelling units where we have people living in individual spaces and sharing a kitchen or a bathroom and having more communal living spaces that will address some of our immediate needs as we start building out some more family-zoned housing.
Available housing is the question. Steve Novick.
Following up on what Annalita said about converting office buildings to housing, it is difficult and expensive. Calgary, Canada is making a big push to do that, so I'm actually interested in talking to folks there and seeing how they're doing it and why they think that's a good investment. Again, I think we've talked about a number of the factors that can increase the availability of housing. Cleaning up the homeless camps, reducing crime to attract more outside investment, changing the zoning laws, making permitting more easy. One thing, Daniel was talking about the high cost of building, quote, affordable housing. And the nonprofits who build affordable housing tell me that they get money from much different sources, the city, the state, Metro, the federal government, and those sources all have dozens of different requirements and they aren't aligned with each other. So one thing that we can do to reduce that cost of, quote, affordable housing is for the city and Metro and the county and the feds to sit down together and figure out how can we streamline that process and have requirements that are fewer and aligned to make it easier for the affordable housing developers to actually build affordable housing.
Lamb, the question is yours.
Yeah, I think just like most people said, we need to build more housing and multi-family housing, not just single-family homes. I think working with developers, maybe even incentivizing them in some way so that they can build more affordable housing would be great. I think also understanding that most people don't want crazy features in a home. They just want like a basic apartment, studio. So just building housing like that would be really important.
Okay, next question now. Voters approved a supportive housing services tax in 2020. Metro, the regional government, oversees that tax. The money that's raised is used for services to prevent people from becoming homeless. It does not pay for housing construction. Do you support, here's your question, do you support changing the region's homeless services tax to redirect some of that money to housing development? Do you agree changing the region's homeless services tax to redirect some of that money to housing development? Jesse Cornett, let's begin with you on this one.
Sure, I'll just take a step back by saying, one, that's a Metro measure, not City of Portland, that was approved by the voters. I think one thing that the City of Portland has failed to do in recent years is treat other governmental entities as if they're partners. So I would love to have a conversation with Metro's government to see what they're thinking on this. They've already started to tip their hand. I do personally think that we should be having this discussion. As it stands right now, keeping people out of homelessness is critically important. Paying for services for those in those experiencing homelessness, as the measure does, is critically important. But what we also need to do is invest in housing so we can actually draw down the number of individuals living on the streets ultimately. And with the success of the measure, this is something that in theory they could do, and I would be supportive of that.
Daniel, your thoughts?
You know, for the last couple of years, I've chaired the Joint Office of Homeless Services Community Budget Advisory Committee, and they just take our advice. They don't have to listen to it, and that's been a problem. But you know, this year we went to them and said, look, you're going to spend $70,000 per every person on the street this year. Can you commit and say that this plan will lead to at least one fewer people sleeping on our streets? And the county would not make that commitment. And as far as I see it, right now we have 4,000 people sleeping on our streets. I don't understand why we can't use that money to build that shelter to get them off of the streets. If Metro wants to come out and say moving this money to housing will lead to one fewer people sleeping on the streets, at least one fewer people sleeping on the streets, I'd be supportive. But right now, I think we need to be moving those funds to get people into shelter. Just the other day, I was at a panel of people who are homeless that was put on to educate candidates. And a number of the people there who had previously been homeless and were sharing their experience were complaining that they had been put into apartments and then didn't receive services. And as a result, they were still addicted to methamphetamine. They were still interacting and dealing with problems on the streets. I think we lack the services right now to get people into housing, and once we get people into shelter, it's going to be a lot easier to stabilize them. We have the funds right now to end unsheltered homelessness. Let's do so first.
Chris Flannery, it's your turn.
No, I don't support changing the use of the Metro Supportive Homeless Services dollars. As was pointed out, it's what the voters voted for. It's what I myself voted for. So that's my personal opinion, but as a representative of District 3, if my constituents wanted something else, I would listen to what my constituents wanted.
Angelito.
I agree with Jesse's analysis as far as the city of Portland has often not respected the will of the voters by trying to overturn ballot measures that were popularly voted in and not respecting other local governments. So I would love to have a discussion with Metro councilors before making a decision like that. I do think that creating affordable housing with that money would be something I would definitely be interested in. But what we consider affordable housing is usually too high for most people these days. And I'm one of 3 or 4 candidates at this point out of our 118 or so running that has experienced unsheltered homelessness. And I was at the same forum with the unhoused folks that came and talked to us about what their experiences were. And what we found was that if they were able to finally get into housing after decades of waiting, you know, usually they didn't have the supportive services needed in order to stay housed and to keep a job and to have the stability needed once they were removed from the trauma of living on the streets. So if that money is going towards that, I think it's really important to keep people housed long term.
Steve Novick, your thoughts?
My concern about that idea is that, as folks have said, we need tens of thousands of more housing units in Portland to address our housing shortage. The homeless services tax brings in a lot of money, but not the billions of dollars you would need to actually fix our housing crisis. So I think that the first priority needs to be getting folks off the street, and the homeless services tax does bring enough money that we could buy those little tiny homes, those pods that we have in places like the tiny house villages for everybody who's on the street. And those villages have been successful. It turns out that it's easier to get people to go to a shelter where there's a door that they can close and they have privacy and safety. So I would focus first on spending the money to do more of that, and the city can help with that by identifying more sites where you can put the tiny house villages. And let's get people off the streets first, while we're working on the long-term problem of just not enough housing available, period.
The question is yours, Al Lam.
Yeah, I think we should stick to what voters choose. And if we were to spend money, I think it should go towards behavioral health services and health addiction services, anything to really help our houseless community and folks who are facing mental health challenges.
Luke Zach?
I agree with the assessment that we need to make sure that we are respecting the will of the voters and that we are collaborating more effectively with the county and with Metro and with whichever jurisdiction, whatever question we're talking about at the time concerns. There's a lot of folks, as I'm out on the campaign trail, that don't always know what is within the city council scope, what is within the county scope, and where that overlaps. So we need to make sure that we are doing our part in educating voters and making sure that everyone understands kind of what roles to play. And that is a huge thing that comes up repeatedly is, for instance, the Joint Office of Homeless Services. There's been a historic lack of understanding about who is responsible for what the metrics are, how we can measure that, and what that definition of success looks like. And so I think we need to make sure that we do that. But I would support that money staying with the services, and as several of us heard at the Lived Experience Forum, making sure that people are receiving the resources that they need if they are experiencing homelessness or if they are experiencing housing instability, to make sure that they do not lose their housing in the first place, or they can stay in it once they are placed.
It's an issue important to a lot of the viewers out there. We heard from a lot of folks. When it comes to homelessness in Portland, there's now a camping ban in public places. You know about that. Do you support fining and eventually jailing people who camp on public property when they've refused repeated offers of shelter, including the option to move into the city's temporary alternative shelter sites? So I'll repeat that. Do you support fining and eventually jailing people who camp on public property when they refused repeated offers of shelter, including the option to move into the city's temporary alternative shelter sites? Daniel, we'll start with you on this one.
You know, I'm proud to have earned the support of our firefighters, our EMTs, our 911 operators, and our police officers. And when I sat down with our police union, I said, look, I was a punk kid. I went to protests in Portland that went badly. One of you here very well may have pepper sprayed me. One of you very well may have had the chance to arrest me, but you didn't, because something that's really important to that job of policing is that you have discretion. You have the choice of whether to actually go through and bring someone into jail. And if you can address a situation and not have to fill out paperwork, that's a win-win for everyone, right? I think it's really important that the city have the authority to fine and jail people for public camping like that, but I'd like to see it used in two ways. One, I think we need to establish some common sense rules about camping, restrictions on size, restrictions on population, restrictions on impact, like using fires or sound. And second, I'd like to see the city say, look, if you as a neighborhood have more shelter beds per capita than the city average, then you can expect zero unsanctioned camping, because we cannot continue to allow Irvington to benefit from the burden that Buckman is taking on by taking on shelter beds. We need to reward neighborhoods who are willing to say, we will shelter people.
Chris?
No, I don't support it. Criminalization isn't an effective way to address being unhoused. And I'm not sure how folks who are unhoused are going to pay their fines, and jailing somebody is the most expensive way to shelter them for the night.
Angelita.
Yeah, I think that the camping ban is pure political theater. It's not effective policy for some of the reasons that Chris outlined. I think that we need to be asking, why is it that unhoused people don't want to go into our shelter spaces? As an anti-hunger policy advocate in my day job, as someone that has been homeless in the city of Portland, I know that there is fear of sexual violence, there is fear of theft, there is fear of a lack of accessibility in the shelters. You're separated from your family, from your pets. There's a lot of reasons why it is very difficult to access shelter spaces, even if one wants to. At the forum we just went to, we also heard that people get lice, they get scabies in some of these shelters. We also heard that when you're outside on the streets, you're attacked with fireworks, BB guns, countless other things, because there is such an anti-homeless rhetoric that is happening in the city that now there is violence against our unhoused neighbors. So putting someone in jail is a very costly thing to do, not just financially for the city, it costs a lot of money, but also having a criminal record for someone, taking them out of their job maybe for a few months when they're sitting in jail is going to make it much harder for them to keep a job, and it's going to make it much harder for them to get into the job market later. So for all of those reasons, I fully believe that that is political theater meant for re-election. It is not a concrete policy solution.
Steve Novick, what do you think?
I think that it shouldn't be off the table, but it should be a last resort. I think that most people, if they're told that there's a humane shelter for them to go to, like the tiny house villages, they will go. And I think that first you go through the process of telling people, if you don't go, we're going to take your stuff and it's going to be a hassle to get it back. If you've gone through that and people have gotten the first person I think who was arrested for violating the ban had been repeatedly offered shelter, including in a tiny house village. So I think that in some extraordinary cases, it is a last resort. But again, I think that you try a lot of other things first.
Lam, your thoughts on this one?
No, I don't support the camping ban. I think it's a waste of resources. I think, just like Annalita said, we need to look at the conditions that people are living in the shelters, making the shelters more safer and actually livable for houseless people. And yeah, I don't think it's criminalizing and jailing people is going to solve anything. So,
Luke, what do you think?
I think that until the city has the quantity and diversity of shelter options needed to house all of our people, this question is a non-starter. Several of us also went to the Clinton Triangle one-year report, and it looks like they have been doing really great work. They have had success in getting folks transitioned into permanent housing, but our shelter system is looking at hundreds of units at a time, not at the thousands of people that are currently living unsheltered on our streets. And we need to have solutions that match the scope of that. And until we do, criminalizing houselessness and poverty is just a non-option.
Let's come back around to the front. Jesse, the question's yours.
I spend my days, my nights, whenever I can, out knocking on doors, talking to voters, and there is no issue more than tents and RVs that folks in Portland want to get resolved. And I think we've had this rush to have a conversation on what we should do with those who choose to live in tents when they're offered alternatives. As a city, we should have never allowed it in the first place. And we're years into it now. And so we have a very big mess to clean up in terms of tents on a meta level. I think that jail is the most expensive and least humane solution that we could be talking about here, but it must exist as a last resort option, as Mr. Novick said.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. Get a little more specific on that one. When it comes to your district, what will you do as a city councilor to help those struggling with homelessness? What will you do as a councilor to help those struggling with homelessness? And Chris, let's start with you on this one.
I think one of the best things we can do is prevent folks from falling into homelessness. Rent assistance can be the difference between us spending $400, $600, $1,000 to prevent somebody from falling into houselessness, or having to spend that much a night, a week, for somebody who's been unhoused for years. So making sure that people in our district are, when they are facing, maybe it's a flat tire, maybe it's a medical emergency. So many of us are one missed paycheck away from being unhoused ourselves. And so having that safety net in place to prevent folks from getting unhoused will allow us to let the resources we are currently working with to process the folks who are already on the street. I think the county took 5,000 people off the street last year, which is a wonderful and amazing number that we were able to provide that much in services, but we just had another 5,000 people fall into houselessness. So we need to stop the bleeding.
Angelita.
Yeah, I agree with what Chris said about preventative measures to keep people housed in the first place. I would also like to see the city build a lot more autonomous shelter models based off of Right to Dream 2. That was an autonomous shelter where the unhoused people actually have a council where they make decisions together about how to run the place and what kind of community they want to have with each other. And that's been really successful because it reduces the abuse that you see when there are inherent power dynamics within a shelter system. So I've worked with those folks very frequently, and it's a fantastic shelter model. I also think that I have a whole policy platform on sanitation, and that's because I used to do neighborhood cleanups at encampments, working with unhoused neighbors who also didn't want to live in a mess. And we would spend from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. bagging up garbage, trying to figure out which city agency to pick up the garbage. And then if we did finally find one, they would come over, cut open the bag of garbage, and tell us the wrong garbage is in this bag and leave it all dumped out. The city already has a way of tracking these big encampments that build up over time, and houseless people have no way to handle the garbage that they accumulate over time. So the city could use those very same systems to actually just help people keep hygienic encampments as we work towards building humane, accessible shelter models.
Steve?
So humane, accessible shelter models are a key. Again, we've seen success with the tiny house villages, and I'd like to see more of those. When I've talked to people in City Hall about that, they said, well, yes, that's a good idea, but it's hard to find sites to put them. But then I talked to somebody else high up in the city that said, that might be true, but the city hasn't professionalized that process of looking for sites. It's like a few staff out of the mayor's office trying to do it. If it's a priority, hire some people with some credentials that it's their whole job to scour the city or maybe outside the city to identify sites where you can have these tiny house villages where people have a door to close, where they do have a shower, etc. And I would encourage the county to, again, as I said before, to invest more of the money that they have, which is the county has most of the money to deal with homelessness, in things like those tiny house villages. On the issue of preventing people from falling into homelessness with rent assistance, that sounds great, and if we could be really targeted about it, it would be great. What I've heard is there's some research that shows that it's really impossible to know exactly who's about to fall into homelessness. So the rent assistance, you might give 100 people rent assistance, and it might save 8 people from falling into homelessness, but the other 92 people wouldn't have to begin with. Again, I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but it's one of those things you have to look to see what bang you're getting for the buck.
Helping those struggling with homelessness. Alam, the question is yours.
Yeah, just like most people said, I think looking at preventative measures. I think also one big takeaway from the lived experience panel was one of the folks brought up having accessible public restrooms. In order for her to like even have a job or keep a job, you need to be clean. So I think normalizing public restrooms and hygienic services is really important. You know, if there's a way that we can even help folks, you know, understand what their skills are and, you know, help them get a job, that would be really helpful too. And just meeting the basic needs of homeless people. A lot of them have different needs, unique needs, and I think understanding what those needs are and helping them receive that service is really important.
Luke?
I think that we need to continue investing in our temporary alternative shelter sites and our Safe Rest villages. I think as we do that, we need to make sure that we are making good on our good neighbor agreements, so that way we can have other neighborhoods that are willing to open their doors and welcome these services into their communities as well. I think we also need to work on developing a system that has real-time shelter bed availability across the entire network, not just of city shelter beds, but of county shelter beds, also the organizational beds like Angelita was talking about, and also uplifting other nonprofits doing the work. There are other organizations like We Shine that focus on particularly vulnerable communities, BIPOC communities, LGBTQ+ communities that may not feel safe in other congregate shelter settings. So I think that those are two really important things. And then lastly, I think it's really intimately connected to our addiction crisis, and I think that we also need to make sure that we are expanding our mobile outreach and have more on-demand treatment and addiction services that can reach folks.
Let's come back around the front. Jesse, your turn.
Sure. So I'm somebody that spent years of my youth living as we would define as homeless today. A very small portion of my adult time in Portland as well. So this is something that I take very near and dear. It's very near and dear to my heart. And of the 6 competitors on the stage today, I've heard a lot of good ideas. 6 plus me. Thank you.
Just checking your math there.
Yeah.
That's all.
Question. Let's spice it up for a minute. Let's get into arguments on the stage. Just the only thing that I'll add to that, if we really want to do something for those suffering on the streets today, we'll expedite the building projects so we can keep people from getting there in the first place and getting somewhere built for them to go.
Daniel?
I think a lot of it is about housing, but when we're looking at the problem right now and seeing people unsheltered on our streets, they have other issues, they have mental health issues, they have drug addiction issues, but the sheltering part we definitely know how to solve. My question for the other candidates on the stage, if you're opposed to fining people for unsanctioned camping, are you comfortable setting up sites where people can camp in a sanctioned way? I absolutely agree that we need a variety of shelter models like To Dream 2, like even the Bybee Lakes facility, like the Clinton Street Triangle, you know, but the Right to Dream 2 site comes in at $2 a day. The Bybee Lakes facility comes in at $36 a day per bed, and the Clinton Street Triangle comes in at $200 a day per bed. We need that variety because that's the only way we're going to be able to actually shelter every single person on the street. I would love to have more housing vouchers. The city of Portland does not have the funds to supply enough housing vouchers to reduce homelessness, but we absolutely have the funds right now every year going to the joint office that could otherwise build shelter for at least 25 to 50% of the people on our streets. One unit of shelter costs $20,000 to $40,000 for each pod. That's the nicest kind of shelter that's available. It's the most effective kind of shelter available. The amount of money we're sending to the joint office could build shelter for 25 to 40 or 50% of the people on our streets. I would like to see a commitment to building 100% shelter capacity, making sure that we have a room to get everyone off the streets within 2 years. And I think that's the best way that we can actually gauge the effectiveness of this new government.
You mentioned joint office, brings us to our next question. City of Portland and Willamette County support the joint office of homeless services. There's been some friction between the city and county over how to address homelessness. Do you support the city staying in the joint office of homeless services? Do you support them staying in that office? Angelita, let's begin with you.
I do. I think that although there has been friction, there's a lot of fantasy proposals of like, we're going to leave the joint office and we're going to magically set something up. It is very hard to set up structures like that have already existed. I think we should focus on improving the structure. And I think the biggest concern that I have with the joint office is that we have millions of dollars in unused funds when we have such a big crisis on our streets. So my top priority there would be to work with the county and figure out what do we need to do to help either hire more employees who can handle the grants and the distribution of funds to make sure that we're getting those dollars out the door. But I think that we should focus on working on that relationship. And I think as we've seen on this stage, the new form of government really encourages a reciprocal, collaborative form of engagement. And those are the kinds of candidates that are going to succeed. And I think we're going to see that with the county as well. It's going to change the relationship.
Steve Novick.
As Angelita said, it is important for the city and the county to have a strong relationship. Julia Brim-Edwards is my county commissioner, and I'm proud to be endorsed by her, and I'm looking forward to working with her on homelessness and other issues over the next few years. I think the city should stay in the joint office, but the threat of withdrawal should always be there if we think that the county is just being irrational. The city should be working with the county, for example, encouraging the county to invest more in things like the tiny house villages, helping the county out with that by identifying more sites where those villages can be put. I also have to say that I think the relationship will naturally get better because as of a few years ago, everybody was mad at the city for everything and people barely knew the county existed. Now everybody's mad at the county too. So I think that shared hostility towards each other will help foster a better relationship.
Lam, what do you think? Should the city stay in the joint office?
Yeah, I think they should stay. And like Angelita said, I think we need to just make sure that the systems that are currently in place are improved. And obviously, I think supporting collaboration between all institutions is really important.
Luke.
I also support staying in the Joint Office of Homeless Services. The viewers at home might know that the current City Council has given a deadline of October 15th for revisiting and making sure that the Joint Office is meeting its metrics and the agreement. And I think that moving forward, if we are to stay in the Joint Office, that we need to make sure that we do have very clear definitions of who is responsible for what aspect, how the money is being spent, what the metrics of success look like, so that if we're not meeting those, we can adjust and make sure that we're actually making headway on this issue.
Jesse?
You know, in 2022, the city had an opportunity to do a long-term contract with the office. They didn't do so. They kicked the can down the road. They did an annual contract. In 2023, they did the same action. But in 2024, they decided to sign a 3-year contract with this look-back period that Luke mentioned on October 15th, which really presents a handful of problems. Number one, they've tied the hand of the next city council. It turns out, as everyone knows, a majority of the current city council is running for mayor. So this look-back period on October 15th, which is coincidentally the week that ballots come out for mayor come out, is pretty cute, and it exemplifies what the city has done in recent years, which has treated our government partners as if they're adversaries. Do I think that the joint office and the county are firing on all cylinders? No. But if that's somebody that you're investing tens of millions of dollars a year in, is that a good way to treat them? No. So I think the city should stay in. Giving up is not an option right now. Too many people would hurt if we decided to go it our own and figure it out on our own. The county can get this right. It's imperative, and we need to support them.
Daniel DeMello, your thoughts on this one?
You know, from what I understand from talking with some people working at City Hall, we would not have continued the partnership without that October 15th deadline. Absolutely agree that it's some political maneuvering, but without that maneuvering, we wouldn't have extended the contract. If the county fails to fulfill those obligations on October 15th, then we should leave. That's what holding government accountable means. If someone makes an agreement with you and they fail to follow through on it, you got to leave the agreement. There's just no reason why we should stay working with a partner that is not delivering on that contractual agreement. You know, the joint office, when I've been working with them on this budget advisory committee, one, they really didn't like it when I suggested that their goal should be their abolition. We should not need homeless services. That's why the original SHS measure had a 10-year sunset, and part of the reason they're looking at the housing is to also throw in an extension indefinitely. We should not be treating this problem like it's something that we need to set up all these services for, because once we have those services set up, we're going to continue to need homelessness to keep people employed. I want to see a commitment to ending unsheltered homelessness as fast as possible, as humanely as possible, as quickly as possible.
Chris, we'll end with you on this question. Go ahead.
Yes, I support staying with the Joint Office of Homeless Services. It is a joint office, so the city has responsibilities along with the county. I had several of my colleagues, actually, our homeless services team was sent over to the joint office. So I know some of the people who are doing that work, and it's hard work, made harder by political gamesmanship, made harder by being uncertain about whether you're going to be funded next year or not. And so I think we need to commit. I think we need to take the electoral politics out of these necessary services. And to Daniel's point about hopefully we solve the homelessness issue in Portland, I'm also looking ahead to the potential of us needing to absorb climate refugees with the increasing climate change.
We're going to switch to public safety now. Oregon recently recriminalized possession of small amounts of hard drugs in Oregon. Do you think it's enough to impact Portland's drug crisis? Do you believe deflection programs designed to deflect people from jail and into addiction treatment will actually work? Steve Novick, your thoughts?
So I think that deflection programs can work if the treatment is actually available. And right now I think we're in a situation where we're going to start arresting people and, quote, deflecting them, but there's not actually services for them to access. I think that it can work because I've talked to a friend of mine who used to be a judge in Multnomah County, and for a while she was like a drug court judge, and she said that she knows that there are people who she sent to drug treatment that went there sort of under the threat of jail, and that made a difference for them. But again, the treatment actually has to be available. And one question is, where do we get the money for enough drug treatment? One thing, and this is like a big systemic change that you'd have to do, but we spend a ton of money in the state on prisons. And long prison sentences are not a very effective way of deterring crime. When somebody is an accessory to an armed robbery, it doesn't really make a difference whether they're put away for 1.5 years or 6.5 years. However, having drug treatment does make a difference. Having more police does make a difference in deterring crime. Investment in community anti-violence services makes a difference in deterring crime. So I'd like to see the county and the city make a deal with the state where we said, if we send fewer people to prison, can we use the savings to invest in things like drug treatment that actually do affect crime?
Lamb, you're up.
Yeah, I think we need to have programs and services that that help people with addiction and who are facing severe drug addiction. So I think investing in behavioral health resources and just overall investing in a system where people can get treatment is really important.
Luke, Zach, let's go to you now. Do you believe deflection programs actually work?
Well, I will say the deflection center was supposed to open in my neighborhood in Buckman, and that was not even opened. We had a hard time implementing Measure 110, and we are having a hard time implementing House Bill 4002. I think when we do open a deflection center, it needs to come along with the treatment resources necessary. We also need to work toward reopening a sobering center and provide more harm reduction techniques as well. I would like to explore opening a safe use center. I would like to explore more needle exchange programs. I would like to explore drug checking programs that can increase the safety in our community. I also think that we need to be working with our state and federal counterparts to work on limiting the drug supply coming into our community.
Jesse.
So by day, I'm the policy and advocacy director for an organization called Oregon Recovers. I deal with addiction policy by day. I spend every minute of every session in Salem when House Bill 4002 was being considered. What House Bill 4002 does is it provides the police somewhere to take individuals who were caught in possession of drugs and did quite literally nothing else wrong. If it was, for instance, breaking and entering and you had drugs on you, sorry, you're not eligible. What the bill did not do, and what nobody in the community is talking nearly enough about, are those that are in these drug-induced hazes who need protection from themselves, who others may need protection from. The deflection centers, we don't have anywhere to deflect to. I talked to one of the providers of the largest treatment center, the head of the largest treatment center in Portland just this weekend. We need 2,200 more beds between treatment and recovery in Portland just to keep up with the current demand just in the city limits of Portland. If you go into deflection, if you're given that opportunity, we don't have anywhere to send you. It doesn't matter how much help you want. As a community, we should be talking about sobering centers instead.
Daniel, your thoughts?
You know, when I was considering running in this race, one instant that really convinced me that Portland needs this change and that I'm prepared to bring it is I had a conversation with a woman who's living unsheltered downtown. Her name was Desiree. And what she told me was that she had become addicted to methamphetamine here in Portland while she was homeless because she wanted to keep herself awake at night to keep herself from being sexually assaulted. And you know, thinking about deflection, I don't imagine that the deflection centers will bring in very many people who are housed. I don't imagine that deflection centers will bring in very many people who are addicted to cocaine or ketamine, right? What we're talking about is a crisis of opiates and a crisis of fentanyl. And I think we need to address those problems in particular ways. And frankly, I voted for Measure 110, and I saw the results, and I would have supported a ballot measure to repeal it. I'm a software engineer by trade. I think results speak for themselves. The question about deflection I have is success here getting someone to no longer be addicted, or is it to reduce the overall rate of addiction? Because those are very different metrics, and while I'd like to see people be brought somewhere that's not jailed for treatment, I think right now there's very few people who are being brought in or we're identifying as just possessing drugs. What we're seeing are people use drugs and then commit other crimes in our communities, and I think that's a very different issue that we need to solve using law enforcement.
Chris, you are up.
I don't think that criminalization of addiction is an effective policy. As Daniel pointed out, this isn't going to get folks doing blow in their own homes. This is another measure. It's meant to target people who are out on the street. And, you know, frankly, we have systems to deal with if somebody's a danger to themselves or others. And the idea that we're going to take away someone's freedom based on this one particular, like, drug use and addiction, this idea of mandatory treatment, like, we all want people to live happy, healthy lives. And sometimes people make different choices than you do. I am concerned about this push towards criminalization, about this push towards mandatory treatment, because it wasn't too long ago that being gay, I could have been forced into mandatory treatment, including in up to a lobotomy. So I have a lot of concerns about moving back into criminalization.
Angelita.
I also have a lot of concerns about moving into criminalization. I think that this is also largely political theater because we don't have the deflection centers and treatment centers necessary to actually take care of people who are willing and begging to get into treatment. The Hoover Center in Oregon has turned away 200 people a month who are asking to get into treatment because we just don't have enough of those beds. I'm also really concerned that now the county is in a position to do a rush job of getting deflection centers up because they don't want to send people into our local county jails because people who have gone into our county jails have died of overdoses. Many of them have. And so now we see these 24-hour deflection centers being put up in District 3, 3 blocks away from an elementary school, where people are going to be preyed upon because if it's only 24 hours and you're leaving the next day, there are going to be drug dealers preying outside. There's not an effective system to get people transported to another safe space afterwards. So I absolutely think that now that House Bill 4002 has been passed, we need to do everything we can to work with our state legislators to get these deflection centers up and running, because the cost of sending people who are sick into jails is that they may possibly die in our local jails of overdoses.
Another public safety question. Obviously, this is big for a lot of folks in a lot of the neighborhoods. What needs to be done to improve public safety in your neighborhood? We'll give you 30 seconds each to answer this one. What needs to be done to improve public safety in your neighborhood? Alam, let's begin with you.
I think we need to invest in programs like Portland Street Response, making sure that they can run for 24 hours and that the staff who are working in those programs are also being paid livable wages and, are able to survive. So,
Luke?
Yeah, in addition to funding Portland Street Response to be around the clock and across the whole city, I think we just need to make sure that we are fully invested in our entire emergency response network. And I think that starts with our dispatchers and making sure that we reduce our response time for folks that need emergency services.
Jesse.
So I'm proud to be supported in my bid for city council by former mayor, one-time police chief Tom Potter. When he was police chief, he ushered in the concept of community policing. If you look at my website, cornetforportland.com, I have an action plan on public safety that includes restoring community policing to Portland.
Daniel DeMello, 30 seconds.
I'm proud to have earned the support of our firefighters, our EMTs, our 911 operators, and our police officers. And I think it's really important that we get that 911 call time down. The other day, I'm going to go pick up litter downtown, and I see 2 people living out of their van engaged in a domestic violence dispute, and I'm on hold for 2.5 minutes. We can talk about who's the appropriate person to send, but while you're on hold, while you're waiting, that does not make you feel safe in your neighborhood.
Chris, 30.
Safer streets, safer sidewalks, better lighting, more activated neighborhoods, because eyes on the street are better than any response you're going to get off of the 911 call.
Angelita.
Yeah, I'd love to see a fully funded and functioning Portland Street Response. I'd also love to see more community and neighborhood protections where people are actually engaging with one another and keeping an eye out for each other. We've seen that work in other cities. And I'd love to see some environmental design changes, like in the Mount Scott Arleta neighborhood, where we put cement barriers up so people couldn't do drive-by shootings in certain areas, and we saw a 2/3 reduction in gun violence.
Steve Novick, public safety.
And I'm in a pretty safe part of my neighborhood in Woodstock, like South Woodstock. I think probably the biggest issue would be car thefts, and the police actually have done a really good job in the past year and a half about being better at recovering stolen cars. There's other places in the district, like there's a single block at 80th and Mason, which this was the site of numerous murders for over a year. And the police finally did go out and start focusing resources there and investing in community anti-violence programs there. And that's something that you need to do, is focus police resources at the specific places where there is the most violence.
That's our final question. I told you guys it would go fast, didn't it? Sort of. Thank you for watching this forum today. There are other candidates running in District 3. We want you to hear from all the candidates running in Portland City Council Districts 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's why later this week you can go to KATU.com and YouTube. Look for K2's Know Your Candidates to see interviews and written statements from dozens of Portlanders running for 12 city council seats. And this Thursday, October 3rd, 11 a.m., we'll bring you the forum with District 4 candidates. That'll be our final one. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'll see you on the news tonight. See you, folks.
The previous special program was sponsored by Willamette University.